Have you ever imagined finding love where you least expected it, amidst the dust and danger of the Old West train tracks? Prepare yourself for a story of courage, sacrifice, and a marriage proposal that changed two destinies forever. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exciting adventures like this. The midday sun was an iron fist beating down on the parched earth when Samuel Blackwood spotted that figure collapsed beside the newly laid tracks of the Pacific Railroad. The hot wind carried the acrid smell of creosote from the ties, and the metallic aroma of heated rails mixed with the distant scent of wild sagebrush. His eyes, accustomed to scanning the horizon for storms or bandits, immediately caught the anomaly in that monochromatic landscape of ochre and rust. A young woman, perhaps no more than 20 years old, lay unconscious on the beaten ground, her raw cotton dress marked by the dust and sweat of the brutal journey under the merciless sun. Samuel dismounted from his black horse, an Arabian stallion, named Tempest, that snorted impatiently under the suffocating heat. The creak of his boots echoed in the oppressive silence as he approached cautiously. Years of solitude had taught the rancher to be wary of traps, but there was something in the fragility of that figure that melted his usual defenses. The desert was like a patient predator, always lurking to devour the weak and unprepared, and that young woman seemed to have been almost swallowed by its invisible jaws. Kneeling beside her, Samuel noticed her lips cracked by thirst, her cheeks sunken by hunger, and a small, worn, leather-bound book clutched against her chest as if it were her most precious possession. The touch of his calloused fingers on her fragile wrist confirmed that life still pulsed beneath her sunburnt skin. With precise movements, the result of years of tending to injured animals on his ranch, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed less than a bale of hay, and this disturbed him deeply. The journey back to the Double Arrow Ranch was marked by silence, broken only by Tempest's rhythmic trot and the young woman's occasional unconscious moan. Samuel kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, where dust clouds danced like restless spirits. His mind, normally focused on practical matters like the price of cattle or the scarcity of water, now wandered into unknown territories. Why was he helping this stranger? In 15 years of managing one of the largest properties in the county, he had built invisible walls around himself, fortresses against the pain of loss and abandonment. The Double Arrow Ranch stretched for thousands of acres, a vastness of pastures that faded into the purple horizon of the distant mountains. The main house, built with pine wood and local stone, rose like a lonely sentinel against the infinite sky. Maria Gonzalez, the Mexican housekeeper who had looked after the property for a decade, nearly dropped the silver tray when she saw Samuel entering with the unconscious young woman in his arms. The first 24 hours were critical. The fever that took hold of the young woman's frail body made Samuel fear the worst. Maria prepared herbal teas following her curandera grandmother's old recipes, while Samuel kept a silent vigil, changing cold compresses on the burning forehead. It was during one of these long nights that the young woman murmured a name in her feverish delirium. Eleanor, a name that sounded like music amidst the oppressive silence of the ranch. When she finally opened her eyes, 3 days after being rescued, Eleanor Whitfield found herself in a spacious room with whitewashed walls and a window that framed the sunset over the plains. The first face she saw was Maria's, smiling motherly as she offered her an aromatic broth. But it was the tall, silent figure standing by the door that captured her attention. Samuel Blackwood had the presence of a mountain, solid and unchanging, but there was something in his gray eyes that hinted at contained storms. Eleanor's recovery was gradual, marked by small victories and moments of vulnerability. At first, she could barely sit up without dizziness overcoming her. Samuel watched her progress with a mix of practical concern and something deeper that he refused to name. During a particularly hot afternoon, when the thermometer read 104 in the shade, he found her struggling to mend her only dress, her fingers still too shaky for the delicate task. Without a word, Samuel disappeared into his office and returned with a package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a length of sky blue fabric, sturdy but beautiful, along with a complete sewing box. The gesture, simple in its execution but profound in its meaning, marked the first moment of genuine connection between them. Eleanor looked up, meeting his eyes, and for an instant time seemed to suspend like the golden dust dancing in the sunbeams, streaming through the window. Life on the ranch followed its ancient rhythms, the distant lowing of cattle at dawn, the clinking of harnesses being prepared, the aroma of strong coffee mixed with the smell of frying bacon in Maria's kitchen. Eleanor, as her strength returned, began to find her place in that everyday symphony. Her delicate hands learned to collect eggs without startling the hens, to milk the gentle cow Maria kept for fresh milk, to recognize the medicinal herbs growing wild by the nearly dry creek. Samuel watched her with growing admiration, though he kept his usual distance. Years of solitude had created habits hard to break, but there were moments, fleeting as a hawk's flight over the plains, when his defenses lowered. Like that morning, he found her feeding the orphan foals in the stable, humming a soft melody that seemed to calm the nervous animals. Or when she insisted on helping during the cattle branding, ignoring the cowboy's protests that it wasn't work for a lady. It was during the third week of her stay that the first real obstacle arose. Tom Morrison, owner of the neighboring Flying M Ranch, showed up with his son James for a visit that clearly had ulterior motives. Morrison was known for his unbridled ambition and for coveting the fertile Double Arrow lands. Seeing a beautiful young woman settled in Samuel's house piqued his curiosity and his calculating plans. During the tense dinner, with the table set with the finest china Maria could dig out, James Morrison couldn't take his eyes off Eleanor. His innuendos about the nature of her presence there were veiled but sharp as razors. Samuel remained silent for most of the meal, but when Morrison suggested that perhaps Eleanor would be more comfortable in an environment more appropriate for a young lady, the rancher's voice cut the air like a whip. The firm but controlled defense Samuel made of Eleanor that night revealed more about his feelings than months of words could have. After the Morrisons left, leaving a palpable trail of tension, Eleanor found Samuel on the porch, watching the stars that were beginning to dot the indigo sky. The silence between them was different now, laden with unspoken possibilities. It was then that Eleanor decided to share her story. Under the silver light of the waxing moon, with the distant song of coyotes as a soundtrack, she spoke of the loss of her parents in a yellow fever outbreak, of the greedy uncle who tried to force her into an arranged marriage to get her small inheritance, of her desperate escape that led her to catch a westbound freight train, with no certain destination beyond escape. Samuel listened in silence, his profile silhouetted against the night sky like a granite sculpture. When she finished, tears shining on her face like liquid diamonds, he did something that surprised them both. He reached out and gently touched hers, a gesture as delicate as a butterfly's landing, but laden with unspoken promises. Days turned into weeks, and the merciless summer began to show signs of a drought that promised to be devastating. The wells began to dry up, the grass turned yellow under the merciless sun, and the cattle began to waste away. Samuel spent long hours studying maps and consulting the older cowboys about alternative water sources. The tension on the ranch was palpable, like the electricity that precedes a summer storm. It was during one of those stifling afternoons that Eleanor made a discovery that would change everything. Thumbing through the small book she always carried, a gift from her late mother, she noticed something strange. Among the yellowed pages of poems and prayers, there was a folded document she had never examined closely. It was an old deed, dated 40 years prior, that guaranteed rights to a parcel of land that included a perennial spring in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The revelation struck Samuel like lightning. That spring could save not just the Double Arrow, but also the neighboring ranches fighting the drought. But the location described in the document was vague, referring to natural landmarks that might have changed over the decades. An expedition would be needed to find it, a dangerous journey amidst the scorching heat and treacherous mountain terrain. The decision to set out in search of the spring was not taken lightly. Samuel gathered his most trusted men, including Jake Thompson, his veteran foreman, and Rodrigo Morales, the best tracker in the region. Eleanor insisted on accompanying them, arguing that she knew the document's details best. Samuel initially resisted, concerned for her safety, but the iron determination in her blue eyes convinced him that it would be useless to try and dissuade her. The expedition set out at dawn on a Monday that promised to be scorching. The group consisted of 6 people, including Eleanor and Maria, who insisted on going to look after the young woman. The horses carried provisions for 2 weeks, though everyone hoped to find the spring much sooner than that. The terrain gradually changed, from the dusty plains to the stony hills, and finally to the steep mountain slopes. On the 3rd day of the journey, when the sun was at its cruel zenith, the first sign of real danger appeared. Fresh tracks in the sand indicated the presence of other riders following their trail. Samuel immediately recognized the horseshoe pattern. They were Morrison's men. No doubt alerted about the expedition by an informant on the ranch. The neighbors' greed knew no bounds, and the possibility of a permanent water source in those arid lands was too tempting to ignore. That night, camped in a protected ravine, Samuel called a council of war. The options were limited. Continuing meant risking a confrontation on unfavorable ground. Turning back meant losing the only chance to save the ranches from the devastating drought. It was Eleanor who proposed the solution. Knowing the terrain from her mother's documents' descriptions, she suggested an alternative route. More difficult, but one that would take them through canyons the pursuers would hardly know. The decision to trust Eleanor's knowledge proved correct. For 2 days, they navigated narrow passes and precarious trails, always watchful for any sign of Morrison's men. The 4th day brought an exciting discovery. Rodrigo found signs of moisture in the soil, and the horses' behavior indicated the proximity of water. Following these clues, they reached a rock formation that exactly matched the description in the old document. The spring was there, hidden behind a curtain of willows that had survived thanks to the constant water. It was a secret oasis in the midst of the aridity, with crystal-clear water bubbling from the rocks and forming a small pool before disappearing again underground. Emotion swept over the group. Jake, normally stoic, let out a shout of joy. Maria fell to her knees, murmuring prayers of thanks. Samuel and Eleanor found themselves in an embrace, a spontaneous gesture born of shared joy. But the celebration was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Morrison and his men had finally caught up to them. The confrontation that followed was tense as a drawn bowstring. Morrison, flanked by 6 armed men, demanded rights to the spring, claiming the lands belonged to an old right of possession that would precede any document. Samuel positioned himself protectively in front of Eleanor, his hand resting on the hilt of the Colt 45 on his hip. The body language of both groups indicated that violence was just one hasty gesture away. It was then that Eleanor stepped forward, the document in her hands, and began to speak with a clarity and authority that surprised everyone. She not only read the document, but explained its provenance, showing seals and signatures that proved its authenticity. More importantly, she pointed to engravings on the rocks around the spring, marks left by the original surveyor that exactly matched the descriptions on the paper. It was irrefutable proof that the land legally belonged to whoever possessed the document. Morrison hesitated, his calculating eyes weighing the options. He could try to take the spring by force, but that would mean bloodshed and later legal trouble. Furthermore, Jake and Rodrigo had positioned themselves strategically, making it clear that any aggression would be met with lethal force. After long minutes of suffocating tension, Morrison finally backed down, muttering vague threats about verifying the document's authenticity in town. With the immediate threat removed, the group worked quickly to map the area and plan how to channel the water to the ranches in the valley. Samuel demonstrated a generosity that surprised even his closest men, proposing a sharing system that would benefit not just the Double Arrow, but also the small landowners who were struggling to survive. Eleanor watched with growing admiration as he drew plans in the sand, his practical mind finding solutions for every logistical challenge. The return journey was marked by a palpable change in the dynamic between Samuel and Eleanor. The barriers he had erected over the years began to crumble like adobe walls in the rain. During the nights around the campfire, he began to share stories of his past, including the devastating loss of his fiancée Sarah to typhoid fever 10 years prior, an event that had turned him into the closed-off and solitary man Eleanor had met. Eleanor listened with compassion, finally understanding the source of the pain she saw in his eyes. In response, she shared more about her own life, about the dreams of becoming a teacher that were shattered by her parents' death, about the loneliness of being an orphan in a world that saw single women as burdens or opportunities. These nighttime conversations, with the crackling of the fire and the distant howl of coyotes as a backdrop, wove invisible but unbreakable bonds between them. The return to the Double Arrow Ranch was triumphant. The news of the spring's discovery spread like wildfire through dry straw, bringing hope to the entire community. In the days that followed, Samuel organized work crews to build the irrigation system. It was a community effort, with ranchers who barely spoke before working side by side. Eleanor became a central figure in this process, her education allowing her to help with calculations and planning. But not all news was good. A letter arrived from the Pacific Railroad, stating that the planned line would pass directly through several properties, including parts of the Double Arrow. The compensation offered was paltry, and the document's language made it clear that resistance would be met with legal and, if necessary, physical force. The shadow of progress threatened to destroy the way of life that generations had built. It was during a tense meeting at the ranch headquarters that Eleanor made another crucial discovery. Examining old maps and legal documents, she realized that the spring's deed included clauses about rights of way that could be used to negotiate with the railroad. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it offered legal leverage that could protect the most vulnerable properties. Samuel watched Eleanor work with a mix of admiration and something deeper. She had transformed from the fragile young woman he rescued on the tracks into a force to be reckoned with. Her intelligence, compassion, and courage had not only saved the ranch, but also transformed the community. And, more importantly for him, they had melted the ice around his heart. Spring arrived with generous rains, as if nature itself were celebrating the spring's discovery. The irrigation system, now complete, transformed the arid lands into green fields. The cattle, once skeletal, regained weight and vigor. The smaller ranches, which had been on the brink of bankruptcy, began to prosper again. Eleanor established a small school in one of the Double Arrow's outbuildings, fulfilling her old dream of teaching. It was during the annual spring dance, a tradition that had been nearly canceled due to the drought, that Samuel made the decision that would change both their lives. The community hall was decorated with wildflowers, and the sound of fiddles and accordions filled the perfumed air. Eleanor wore a new dress, made from the blue fabric Samuel had given her months before, and her beauty lit up the room like the rising sun lights the plains. When the music changed to a slow waltz, Samuel approached and, with a formal bow that drew smiles from those present, asked her to dance. As they moved across the floor, his eyes never left hers. In the middle of the music, he led her onto the porch, where the full moon bathed everything in silver light. There, with the distant sound of the music and the scent of honeysuckle in the air, Samuel Blackwood, the man who had sworn never to love again, knelt. The words he spoke were simple, but laden with contained emotion. He spoke of how she had brought light to his darkness, hope to his despair, love to his heart parched like the land before the rain. The ring he offered had belonged to his mother, kept for years in a strongbox, waiting for someone worthy to wear it. Eleanor, with tears rolling freely down her face, said yes before he even finished speaking. The wedding was celebrated at the end of summer, when the golden wheat fields stretched to the horizon, and the air was heavy with the promise of an abundant harvest. The ceremony took place outdoors, under the large oak they had planted together months before, and which already showed vigorous signs of growth. The entire community attended, including Morrison, who had finally accepted the new order of things and even contributed to the community effort. Maria wept copiously throughout the ceremony, murmuring blessings in Spanish. Jake Thompson served as best man, his normally stern face softened by a genuine smile. Rodrigo played the guitar as the couple exchanged vows they had written themselves, words that spoke of solitary journeys that had found their common destiny. of two souls who had discovered that home wasn't a place, but rather each other's presence. The reception stretched late into the night, with dancing, music, and abundant food. The tables were laden with the bounty of the land they had fought, so hard to preserve. The wedding cake, a monumental creation by Maria, had 3 tiers and was decorated with sugar flowers that looked almost real. Stories were shared, some true, others embellished by time and whiskey, about the hard days of the drought and the miraculous discovery of the spring. As the party continued, Samuel and Eleanor slipped away for a moment of privacy on the same porch where they had shared so many important conversations. The distant sound of music and laughter created a perfect soundtrack for their silent contemplation. The stars shone like diamonds scattered on the black velvet of the sky, and the night wind carried the scent of sage and fulfilled promises. The years that followed brought their own challenges and blessings. The railroad finally arrived, but the agreements negotiated by Eleanor ensured its impact was minimized. The Double Arrow prospered, becoming not just a successful ranch, but a model of sustainable land management. Eleanor's school grew, attracting children from across the county, planting seeds of knowledge that would blossom for generations. Children came, 3 in all, each carrying Samuel's strength and Eleanor's intelligence. The eldest, Thomas, showed aptitude for the ranch business. The middle child, Sarah, named after Samuel's first love, inherited Eleanor's gift for teaching. The youngest, William, surprised everyone with his talent for music, filling the house with melodies Maria swore made the angels weep. But it was the intangible legacy that proved to be the most lasting. The story of how a solitary rancher found love beside the train tracks, of how a helpless orphan brought salvation to an entire community, became local legend. Travelers passing through the local saloon inevitably heard the story, each narrator adding their own embellishments, but always keeping the heart of the truth. Decades later, when both their hair was white as the snow on the distant mountains, Samuel and Eleanor could still be seen walking hand in hand through the fields they had saved together. The oak they planted on their wedding day had become a majestic tree, its deep roots drinking from the same spring they had discovered, its branches providing shade for new generations of children playing at its base. On quiet afternoons, sitting on the same porch where so many important conversations had taken place, they would sometimes recall that fateful day on the tracks. Eleanor still kept the small leather book, now even more worn by time, but containing within its pages not just the deed that had changed everything, but also love letters Samuel had learned to write, poems that attempted to capture what spoken words could never fully express. The Old West had changed around them. Towns grew, tracks multiplied, the wild world was gradually tamed, but at the heart of the Double Arrow, certain values remained unchanged. Hospitality for those in need, for you never knew when a stranger on the tracks might carry salvation. Generosity with resources, for water, like love, flowed more abundantly when shared. Courage to defend what was right, even when it was easier to yield. And so, as the sun set once more over the plains, painting the sky with shades of red and gold that no artist could capture, Samuel and Eleanor Blackwood remained as witnesses to a simple but profound truth, that in the arid heart of the desert, where survival was a daily struggle and loneliness a constant companion, love could spring forth like water from a rock, transforming not just 2 lives, but an entire world around them. Golden dust danced in the last sunbeams, and the wind whispered stories through the sagebrush and cacti, carrying the promise that, even in the most unlikely places, even in the most desperate moments, hope could bloom. The desert, which had once been a mirror to Samuel's solitary soul, now reflected the abundance of a shared life, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't found, but rather cultivated, watered with patience, faith, and unconditional love. And you, when will you let hope bloom in your desert?